The world is not an equitable place. No matter what resource we consider, whether it's food, energy, water, minerals, or something else, the reality of the world is that some people in some countries will have more resources than others. The same thing is true when we consider the environmental impacts of our societies, things like air pollution or water pollution. These impacts are rarely equally or fairly distributed. And in far too many cases, the impacts of development fall most heavily on the poorest and the least powerful people in society. For all these reasons, it's important to start off this course thinking about equity and justice, and to consider how these concepts interact with the more environmentally oriented aspects of sustainability. Through the rest of the course, we'll come back to these points, but for now, here's a hint of what's to come. As we move through this course, we'll learn about our food systems, the state of fresh water, the causes of climate change, and many other topics. But to start with, this map from the World Bank says more about the current state of the world than perhaps any other statistic. In this map, the countries in red have average annual incomes exceeding $12,000 per year. In the US, for example, the median personal income is in the low $30,000 range. In the countries shown in the darkest shade of blue, incomes are below $1,025 per year. That's under $3 per day, and it's about half of that in the world's poorest countries. It doesn't take much data analysis to tell you that life under $3 a day looks very different from life in the world's wealthiest countries. For those who have never traveled to the world's poorest places, here's a snapshot from inside a truck driving down a road in Niger. Niger is one of the world's poorest countries and has one of the highest child mortality rates on the planet due to poor health conditions and inadequate nutrition. Much of the economy revolves around agriculture, yet production is low, droughts are common, and food insecurity is a constant worry. If we quickly survey some of the basic resources needed for life, we see the same thing over and over again. Some countries have abundant resources for their citizens, and some do not. But even within a wealthy country, access to resources are rarely equal. Electricity is essential to modern life, and yet about 900 million people don't have it at all. And amongst those that do have electricity, the use is highly unequal, with wealthy countries dominating global consumption. If we look at water, 2.2 billion people lack access to safe drinking water, and even in the United States, safe water access is not available to everyone. On the Navajo Nation in northern Arizona and New Mexico, about 40% of residents don't have running water. Lastly, if we look at food, about 1 in 10 people on the planet will go to bed tonight without enough to eat. Most live in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, but even in the U.S., about 17 million households will be food insecure at some point this year. So what does food insecurity and a lack of access to clean water have to do with environmental change and sustainability? A lot, as it turns out, but it hasn't always been that way. The environmental movement dates back to the early 1900s and started with calls to protect wild and beautiful places like the Yosemite Valley in California. This idea of preserving natural settings and conserving the natural biodiversity of the planet still is a key part of discussions around sustainability. However, more and more we find ourselves thinking not just about natural landscapes, but also about the people who depend on both natural and human systems for survival. If society, or parts of society, lack access to food, water, or energy, then how sustainable is society likely to be over the long run? Before we move forward, let's take a quick look at two examples of how environment, equity, and sustainability come together in complicated ways. At the global scale, the causes of famine are increasingly related to a complicated mix of factors, including conflict, food prices, natural disasters, governance failures, and climate change. In fact, droughts have been linked to food crises and subsequent conflicts in a number of locations around the world. As we look toward a warmer and in some cases drier future, one observation stands out. In most cases, the people who will be most affected by climate change will be those with the least resources. Like a farmer in Niger, it will be the poorest populations with the least ability to adapt to a changing climate that are most likely to be the impacted ones. In other words, the people who will suffer are not the same as the people who caused the climate crisis in the first place. Another example. When you think about pollution, you may think about a large city like Los Angeles, but the reality of air pollution impacts are much more complicated. As it turns out, the people most likely to be impacted by air pollution are those that live closest to sources, such as freeways. Students in elementary schools close to freeways are more likely to have asthma or other respiratory illnesses than those in elementary schools that are farther away. Not surprisingly, it also turns out that students in these locations are often more likely to be economically disadvantaged and more likely to be from an underrepresented group in the United States. As with climate, the environmental impacts of economic activity often fall most heavily on the poorest and most disadvantaged members of our society. To wrap up this video, the take-home message here is that sustainability is a balance between many different factors. A common diagram shows a small intersection point between the economy, society, and the environment where sustainable decisions are made. This is a nice way to illustrate these ideas in a figure, but the reality is that most decisions are difficult and have consequences that are hard to predict. Equity, or justice, is one of the key factors that influence whether or not a decision is ultimately going to be sustainable, and it's one of the most challenging areas to assess. As we move forward, we'll return to these points, and we'll also continue to find ways to use data, when we can, to help evaluate the impacts of different decisions. In the next video, we'll start that exploration.